Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, imagine yourself listening to this story, the exact time glowing on your screen, the place you're sitting in right now. People in different countries, at different hours of night and day, all connected by one name that has almost vanished from official history, but refuses to die in the shadows of the Ozark Mountains. The tall pines of the Ozarks have witnessed generations of hardship, quiet lives and forgotten tragedies, but few stories as unnervingly strange as what unfolded in the winter of 1915 in southern Missouri, where mist clings to the valleys and weak sunlight struggles to push through the dense forest canopy. One lonely ridge above Jack's Fork River became the center of a mystery that still defies explanation. This is where the case of 12-year-old Clara Caldwell began to slip out of the ordinary world and into something far more unsettling. December 18, 1915, a bitterly cold morning in Shannon County. The Caldwell family home stood isolated on a ridge, about 7 miles from the nearest town of Eminence. For nearly 2 weeks, no one had seen any sign of life at the property. No smoke rising from the chimney, no tracks in the snow, no movement around the barn. Winter made isolation normal in these hills, but even in the Ozarks, a house that goes completely silent starts to trouble people. Neighbor Hiram Jenkins, whose farm lay about a mile away, had watched the Caldwell place for days. He noticed the chimney stayed cold, even as the temperature dropped and the snow deepened. At first, he told himself the family was simply riding out the weather, but sooner or later, someone had to fetch supplies or cut more wood. When nothing changed, he saddled up and rode into Eminence. By the time he found Sheriff Thomas Lawson and told him what he'd seen, or rather, what he hadn't seen, there was already a knot of cold worry in his gut. The path to the Caldwell cabin twisted through dense pine forest and crossed Jack's Fork River by a narrow, ice-slicked footbridge. Lawson and Jenkins pushed through nearly 2 feet of snow, their boots crunching and sinking, their breath hanging white in the frozen air. The deeper they went, the quieter the woods became. No birds, no distant axe blows, no barking dogs, just the whisper of wind through trees and the dull ache of cold in their bones. Later, in a sworn statement, Jenkins would say, "Something felt wrong the minute we crossed that bridge. No tracks in the snow, no smoke, no sound. That house was sitting there like it was holding its breath." When they reached the cabin, the absence of life felt almost physical. Lawson stepped onto the small porch and knocked on the front door. No response. He knocked again, harder, still nothing. He tried the latch. The door swung open easily. In that isolated region, most families kept their doors locked in winter, not so much from fear of people as from the harsh wild outside. An unlocked door on a silent homestead was the first real sign that something was badly out of place. Inside, the air was icy. The main room was neat, almost unnervingly so. The wood stove held only a bed of cold grey ash, no glowing coals, no lingering warmth. On the table, a cup of tea sat half empty, the surface frozen solid. There were no toppled chairs, no scattered belongings, no signs of struggle or hasty escape. If anything, it looked as though the Caldwells had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to come back. Robert and Mary Caldwell's clothing still hung on pegs by the door, his work coat and her worn shawl waiting for shoulders that would never slide into them again. Their few valuables remained untouched on the mantel. Mary's mother's silver brooch catching the pale light, Robert's pocket watch still and silent. In the main bedroom, the bed was perfectly made with crisp, tight corners, as if no one had slept there for several nights. Robert's work boots stood neatly beside the bed. On a small vanity, Mary's hairbrush rested where she had last set it down, strands of her dark hair still caught in the bristles like a frozen moment of ordinary life. Nothing in the main room or the parents' bedroom explained why the chimney had gone cold, why the family had vanished, or why their house sat like a perfectly arranged stage with all the actors missing. It was when Lawson and Jenkins moved toward the smaller back room, the room that belonged to their daughter Clara, that the air seemed to change. The door to Clara's room was partially open, Lawson pushed it the rest of the way and stopped. For a moment he didn't say anything at all. Jenkins, crowding in behind him, peered over his shoulder and swore under his breath. Clara was there. She sat at a small wooden desk by the single window, back straight, head bent over a notebook. Her hand moved slowly but steadily, pencil scratching softly against paper. She didn't look up when they entered. She didn't seem to hear them at all. Her skin was pale, but she was clearly alive. Her room, unlike the rest of the cabin, was warm. Not just less cold, warm. A faint heat pressed against Lawson's face as he stepped inside, surprising him. Yet no stove burned there, no fire in a grate, no visible source of that warmth. It was as if the heat simply pooled inside the four walls, refusing to spread into the rest of the house. Then there were the walls themselves. Nearly every inch of bare wood was covered, sheets of paper pinned or tacked to the boards, lines drawn directly onto the timber. Diagrams, spirals, columns of numbers, symbols that neither Lawson nor Jenkins could recognize. The desk was buried in notebooks, each one filled from margin to margin with dense, tiny writing and complex mathematical formulas. The floor beside the desk was stacked with more pages. The bed, the small trunk, even the window frame carried marks and figures scratched into them. Lawson had not studied much beyond basic schooling, but even he understood that children did sums and maybe copied simple shapes, not this. The symbols on the walls looked like the kind of thing you might see in a college professor's book, not in a 12-year-old girl's bedroom in the backwoods of Missouri. Jenkins, who could barely read at all, muttered nervously, "This ain't schoolwork. This ain't right." Clara's hands were stained with ink up to the wrists. Black and dark blue smeared into the lines of her fingers, under her nails, across the backs of her hands. It looked as though she had been writing and writing and writing without pause, as if the act of stopping simply wasn't an option. Her shoulders were rigid, but there was no obvious sign of fear, just an eerie, complete focus. "Clara?" Lawson said softly. No response. He stepped closer. "Clara, it's Sheriff Lawson. Where are your mama and daddy?" Still nothing. Her pencil continued its slow journey across the paper, as if the question had never been asked. The only sound in the room was that lonely scratching, like a small insect trapped on a window pane. Finally, Lawson reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Clara's fingers stiffened. The pencil stopped. For a long moment she sat frozen, her head still bowed. Then, almost painfully, she lifted her face. Her eyes moved sluggishly, as if they had forgotten how to focus on another living person. She blinked once, twice, and then the world in front of her seemed to come into view. Her gaze met Lawson's. There was no scream, no outburst, no collapse into tears. Just a quiet, tired awareness that felt wrong in a child's face. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, and Lawson would later write her words in his report with careful, deliberate strokes, as if afraid of getting them wrong. "They're gone," she said. They had to go. The numbers needed room. It was a sentence that made no sense, and yet fit the room in a way that made Lawson's skin crawl. He asked her again where her parents were, what had happened, whether someone had come to the cabin. Each time he pushed, her answers circled back to the same idea. They had to make room. There wasn't enough space. The numbers needed more. While Jenkins rode back through the deep snow to fetch Dr. Hayes from town, Lawson remained in that strange little room with Clara and the silent humming presence of all those equations. The house felt less like an empty home and more like a shell, a container that had once belonged to a family but now belonged to something else entirely. Outside, the wind scraped its fingers along the walls. Inside, the only sound was the faint, insistent scratch of pencil on paper. Every time Lawson looked away or paused his questions, Clara slipped back into her writing, as if pulled by an invisible current. Nothing in his training as a small town sheriff had prepared him for this, not just missing parents, but a child changed into something he did not understand, surrounded by knowledge no one could explain. He could not know, sitting in that dim, warm room as night closed over the Ozark hills, that the words he had already heard, "They had to go," The numbers needed room would become the first line in a case that would haunt doctors, professors, and entire institutions for decades. All he knew was that something had happened in that cabin that the snow, the forest, and the silence were trying their best to hide. And whatever it was, it had started with a girl, a pencil, and numbers that seemed to demand more space than a single human mind was ever meant to give. The night Clara was brought into eminence settled over the town like a heavy blanket. Snow muffled every sound, lanterns flickered behind frosted windows, and the Hayes home, usually warm and lively, felt strangely tense as Dr. William Hayes carried the silent girl inside. His wife, Judith, bundled in a wool shawl, took one look at Clara's ink-stained hands and pale, unfocused eyes, and understood immediately that this was no ordinary case of exposure or shock. They settled Clara into the spare bedroom, a small space with a quilted bedspread and a kerosene lamp glowing softly on the dresser. The warmth didn't seem to reach her. She sat where she was placed, hands folded loosely in her lap, blinking slowly, as if everything she saw was filtered through some distant layer of thought. Dr. Hayes examined her again under better light. Physically, she appeared unharmed, her pulse steady, her lungs clear, no head injuries, no fever, no signs of malnutrition. And yet her reactions, slow to rise, slow to respond, felt out of sync with the world around her. When he asked, "Clara, do you know where your mother and father have gone?" She turned her head with effort, eyes pale and unfocused, and murmured, "They had to make room. There wasn't enough space anymore." No child should say such words in such a calm, detached tone. Hayes felt a coldness in the room that the stove could not chase away. He tucked her into bed, blew out the lamp, and said softly, "Rest now. We'll talk again in the morning." Judith Hayes hardly slept that night. She checked on Clara every few hours, expecting tears, confusion, fear, anything normal for a child whose parents were missing, but Clara never cried. She never called out. She simply lay still, eyes half open, whispering numbers into the darkness, as if reciting a lullaby known only to herself. By morning, Clara had filled an entire notebook. Judith found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, hunched over the pages, pencil gripped tight. The moment Judith stepped into the room, Clara spoke without looking up, as though continuing a conversation that had begun in her dreams. "It's louder in the mornings," she said. "The knowing wakes up first." Judith didn't understand the words, but something in Clara's tone made her chest tighten. She backed out of the room quietly and went to fetch her husband. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Hayes kept meticulous notes. Judith wrote even more detailed observations in her personal journal, entries later submitted to the sheriff as evidence. December 20th, Clara sleeps very little. She writes constantly. William says the symbols she draws aren't from any child's arithmetic. They look advanced. She fills page after page. When I ask her to stop, she becomes distressed. Not angry, just frightened, like the writing is the only thing tethering her to us. December 21st, she filled 7 tablets today, 7. Her hands should ache, but she never complains. At supper, she barely ate, but she thanked me politely when I placed the food down. She seems kind, but not present, as if she's listening to something far away. December 22nd, I asked again where her parents went. She answered the same as before. They had to make room. I don't know what that means. At times I think she is only repeating a phrase she doesn't understand. But then she looks at me with such knowledge in her eyes, as though she knows far more than she should. It frightens me. Dr. Hayes wrote his own concerns in medical language, but the fear underneath was plain. The girl displays extraordinary cognitive focus on advanced mathematical constructs far beyond her age or education. She interacts when prompted but immediately returns to her writing. No hallucinations observed. Yet her statements suggest an altered perception of reality. He knew they could not keep her in their home much longer. This was no simple trauma response. Whatever was happening inside Clara's mind was growing, expanding like something alive. Word spread quickly through eminence. In small towns, stories travel faster than truth. Within 2 days, people whispered about the girl writing equations that no one could understand. Some said she had been possessed. Others said her parents had gone mad. A few insisted the family had experimented with things they shouldn't have. By December 23rd, a stranger arrived in town, a university mathematician named Professor James Morgan, who had heard rumors through a distant relative. He brushed past the sheriff, insisting he see the notebooks himself. When he entered Clara's room, he froze. She sat at her desk, hair hanging around her face in soft tangles, pencil dancing across the paper in smooth, deliberate movements. Equations spiraled outward from the center of each page, layered like vines twisting up an unseen trellis. The symbols were complex but organized, elegant. This was not the frantic scribbling of a distressed child. This was work. Calculations with purpose. When Morgan examined the pages, he felt a chill so deep he later struggled to describe it. "These are not the scribbles of a savant," he whispered. "These are the results of a trained mind. A brilliant mind. A mind working at a level we have not yet reached." He turned slowly toward Clara, a 12-year-old girl who looked up at him with tired eyes and said, "I don't understand it either. It just arrives." Morgan's hands trembled as he lifted a page. "Arrives from where, Clara?" She blinked once. As if confused by the question, she said quietly. It opened. It poured in. "And now there isn't enough room." Morgan stared at her, feeling the edges of reality blur. He would later write in a letter, "What I witnessed in that room defies every rational explanation. It is as though knowledge has been inserted into a mind unprepared to contain it." As Christmas approached and the snow deepened, it became clear that Clara Caldwell wasn't just a missing person's witness. She was the opening act of a mystery far greater. One that the sheriff could not investigate. One that the doctor could not cure. One that the professor could not explain. And one that Clara herself could barely endure. Something had arrived in her thoughts. Something hungry, something vast. And whatever it was still growing. Snow blanketed eminence in a heavy silence the week after Clara was found. Churches prepared for Christmas, families gathered around stoves, and the little town tried to pretend that everything was normal. But inside the Hayes home, normal had vanished the moment Clara crossed the threshold. Dr. Hayes had seen fever madness, head injuries, even cases of delirium from cold exposure. But nothing like this. And Professor James Morgan, who had stayed in town after witnessing Clara's notebooks, seemed unable to sleep. He spent hours staring at her equations, tracing them with trembling fingers, muttering that something was wrong with the math. Not because it was incorrect, but because it was too correct, as though it belonged to a future that hadn't arrived yet. On December 24th, as lantern light flickered against frosted glass, Morgan and Dr. Hayes sat in the kitchen whispering urgently while Judith prepared tea. The notebook between them was open to a page filled with symbols neither man could fully decipher. "This part here," Morgan whispered, "I've seen nothing like it. Not in Euclid, not in Riemann, not in any modern theory. This child is constructing systems we haven't developed yet." Dr. Hayes rubbed his face, exhausted. "But how? She has no books, no teacher, no access to anything beyond a one-room schoolhouse." Morgan shook his head. "That's exactly the problem. This is not learned knowledge. It's imposed." Before Hayes could question him, Judith's voice called from the spare room. "William, she's awake again. You'd better come." They found Clara sitting upright in bed, wide awake despite having slept barely 2 hours. Her face was pale, her lips cracked. Yet her eyes held a brightness that didn't belong to a tired child. On her lap was a sheet of paper, one that she had somehow filled in the dark. Morgan leaned closer, and for the first time since arriving, his confidence broke. This isn't possible," he whispered. "This is describing movement through multiple dimensions. She's modeling rotational space-time. No one has even conceptualized this yet." Clara looked up calmly. "I told you. I don't make it. I just hold it until it stops hurting." Morgan swallowed hard. "Clara, does it hurt now?" She nodded slowly, touching her temple. "It always hurts when they come close." Dr. Hayes froze. Who comes close? Clara tilted her head slightly, as though listening to something no one else could hear. The visitors, she said. The ones who opened the sky. Judith stepped back, crossing herself. Morgan forced his voice to remain steady. Clara, what visitors? Did someone come to the cabin? It wasn't people. She tapped her forehead lightly. It was knowing. It filled the house first, everywhere. Mama cried, Papa held my shoulders. They tried to make it stop. Her small hands trembled, but there wasn't enough room for all of us. Dr. Hayes exchanged a tense look with Morgan. The girl wasn't describing a person. She was describing an event. Something not visible, not physical, yet real enough to take over her mind. He knelt in front of her. Clara, when your parents disappeared, was it because of this knowing? She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. They couldn't hold any. I had to. The simplicity of her tone made the words even more terrifying. Hold what? She pointed to her head, then her chest. The answers. There was no boast in her voice, no pride, just exhaustion. That night, after Clara finally lay down, Judith tried to convince her husband to send her straight to the state hospital. She's not safe here, William. She barely eats. She doesn't sleep, and she's writing things no child should know. Something is wrong, deeply wrong. But Dr. Hayes hesitated. Judith, if we send her away, we may never understand what happened to her, or what happened to her parents. What about us? Judith whispered. What if whatever changed her follows? Neither of them slept. The next morning, Christmas Day, proof arrived that Clara's condition was worsening. Judith entered the spare room and gasped. Every wall was covered. Sometime in the night, Clara had risen and written over the wallpaper, the trim, even the windowsill. Symbols spiraled from floor to ceiling, weaving together like a strange language of numbers. Clara sat in the center of the room, trembling. Judith hurried toward her. Sweetheart, what's wrong? Clara lifted her face slowly. They came back, she whispered. To take more. More of what? She pressed her hands against the sides of her head. The room. They need more room. Dr. Hayes felt something cold settle inside him. Not fear, not yet. Something worse. Recognition. Understanding in some form he didn't want. As Clara rocked gently, Morgan stared at the walls, horrified. These patterns, he murmured. They're converging toward something. Toward an answer. Something she is being pushed to complete. Judith clutched her shawl. Complete what? Morgan didn't look at her. The equation she's receiving. Clara's voice broke through the room like a whisper from underground. They won't stop, she said. Not until it's finished. She looked up at them, finally frightened. And I don't know what happens when it's done. By nightfall, one thing was clear. Clara was not just remembering something, she was transmitting it, receiving it, channeling it. And whatever she was channeling was far too big for a human mind. By the end of December 1915, Clara's condition had grown so alarming that even the most skeptical townspeople realized this was no ordinary case. A missing family was one thing. A child speaking in riddles while filling notebooks with advanced mathematics she could never have learned was something entirely different. After Christmas, a heavy storm rolled across the Ozarks. Snow beat against the Hayes house in thick waves, rattling the windows, muting the roads, and isolating the family with a presence none of them could fully understand. The air inside the home felt strained, as if the very walls had absorbed Clara's restless energy. Dr. Hayes and Professor Morgan worked day and night to examine her writings, but every time they thought they recognized a pattern, it dissolved into something more complex, more layered, more alien. She's not solving equations, Morgan whispered one evening, exhaustion deepening the lines on his face. She's receiving them. Judith, standing at the stove, paused with her hands folded tightly before her apron. Receiving them from where? Before Morgan could answer, a soft voice drifted from the hallway. From them. They turned. Clara stood there barefoot, ink staining her fingers and the sleeves of her nightdress. Her hair fell around her face in tangled curls, but her eyes, Those distant, haunted eyes seemed older than she was. Dr. Hayes stepped toward her. "Clara, sweetheart, you should be resting." "I can't," she said quietly. "They don't rest." She lifted her small hands and pressed them to her temples. "The knowing doesn't sleep. It keeps moving, pushing, filling up the empty places." Judith shivered. "What knowing, Clara? Who is doing this to you?" Clara shook her head slowly. "Not who, what?" She struggled for a moment, as though trying to find words for something that didn't fit inside human language. "It's like a place," she whispered. "A place made of numbers. They live inside the spaces between everything. They found me because I could hear them." Morgan's breath caught. "Hear them? How long have you been hearing them?" Clara blinked as if trying to remember. When she answered, her voice was barely a whisper. "Since the cold night." The cold night. The night her parents disappeared. The night the cabin fell silent. The night something entered Clara's mind. Hayes and Morgan exchanged looks. It was no longer possible to pretend she was simply traumatized. Something had happened to her. Something that defied their training, their reason, their understanding of the world. That night, they took turns watching her. But Clara was always one step ahead. Every time Judith checked on her, the girl was awake, scribbling symbols faster than any child should be able to write. Every time Morgan entered, she covered her ears as though trying to block out a sound no one else could hear. Every time Dr. Hayes approached, she asked him the same question: "Is there more paper?" By dawn on December 28th, she had filled another 12 notebooks. Her hands shook from effort. Her lips were pale, her pupils dilated. Yet she refused food, refused water, refused rest. "The numbers won't stop," she told Judith. "Not until the whole thing is finished." Judith knelt beside her. "Finished? Finished with what?" Clara tapped her paper with the tip of her pencil. "The pattern." Morgan leaned closer. "What is the pattern?" Her voice broke. "I don't know. I only see pieces." Morgan exhaled shakily. "Then how do you know when it's done?" Clara lifted her gaze, and in those moments her eyes looked less like a child's and more like something ancient peering through her. "They'll tell me." That afternoon, a breakthrough, or something like it, occurred. Clara suddenly stopped writing. Her pencil fell from her hand. She looked up, confused, as if waking from a long dream. She whispered. Morgan snapped to attention. "Quiet. What do you mean?" She blinked rapidly. They stopped talking. Dr. Hayes knelt in front of her. "Clara, focus on me. Are you in pain?" She shook her head. "No, they just went away." For the first time since arriving at their home, Clara looked like a normal 12-year-old girl. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed. She even smiled, small, tired, but real. Judith cried tears of relief. Morgan wasn't relieved. He felt dread. Because Clara hadn't said they're gone. She said they went away. As if they would come back. As if they were watching. As if they were waiting. At midnight, Clara's scream shattered the quiet. Judith ran into the room first, followed by Morgan and Hayes. Clara was curled on the floor, clutching her head, sobbing. "They came back," she cried. "They came back and they're angry. They said I'm too slow." Morgan grabbed her shoulders. "Who said that? Who?" Clara's entire body trembled. "They need the pattern finished." "They don't care if it breaks me. They need more room. There's not enough room in my head." Her voice dissolved into raw panic. Judith held her tightly, whispering, "It's all right, sweetheart, it's all right." But Clara shook violently. "No, it's not all right." "They're pushing again. They're pushing so hard." She pointed at the window. "They're closer now." Morgan turned toward the window. There was nothing outside, nothing but darkness and falling snow. Yet for the first time he felt watched, not by a person, not by an animal, but by something cold, vast, and patient. Something that had found a child's mind in the middle of the Ozarks, and wasn't finished with her. Not yet. By sunrise, there was no more debate. Clara had to be moved. Whatever was happening inside her mind was accelerating, consuming her faster than any of them could manage. She needed treatment. She needed specialists. She needed help that no doctor in Shannon County could give. But as they prepared to take her away, Professor Morgan felt the first real flicker of terror. If Clara was a receiver, if this knowing was coming from somewhere, if something out there had chosen her, would it follow? Would it stop? Would it ever let her go? Or had the Caldwell cabin been only the beginning? The morning Clara was taken from Eminence began with a heavy, unnatural stillness. Snow fell in soft sheets, blanketing the roads in white, turning every branch into a frozen sculpture. The Hayes home, usually a refuge of warmth and kindness, felt claustrophobic, its walls burdened by the weight of what Clara had endured during the night. Dr. Hayes packed his medical bag with trembling hands. Judith helped Clara into a thick winter coat, though the girl barely reacted. Professor Morgan stood by the doorway, clutching Clara's notebooks tightly against his chest like sacred texts. "She needs to be somewhere with better resources," Hayes said quietly. "Somewhere with neurologists, with psychiatrists. Somewhere they can study this." Morgan nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. "But will they understand? Will they even believe what they're seeing?" Judith tied Clara's scarf gently beneath her chin. The girl didn't protest, but her eyes were glassy, distant, seeing things the others could not. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Judith whispered. Clara blinked slowly. "They were here, before dawn." Morgan stiffened. "Ooh, the ones who opened the sky." Her voice drifted like breath over ice. "They whispered that I'm almost out of time." That sentence struck every adult in the room like a stone. Almost out of time. For what? For the pattern, for the knowledge, for something worse. The journey to Farmington, where Missouri State Hospital stood, was long and bitterly cold. First, Hayes drove the wagon through deep snow until they reached the nearest rail depot. From there, they boarded a small, drafty train car that rattled through the Ozark foothills. Clara did not look out the window. She didn't react to the whistle of the steam engine. She didn't ask questions or express fear, she wrote. Even as the train bounced over frozen tracks, she scribbled equations at dizzying speed. 7 pages were filled before they reached the first stop, 14 more by the next. At one point, Dr. Hayes leaned closer and asked gently, "Clara, what are you calculating?" "The motion." She didn't look up. "The train's movement. The vibrations. They have patterns. Everything has patterns." Morgan watched, equal parts amazed and terrified. "She's not measuring," he whispered. "She's translating reality into mathematics, as if it's the only language she can understand now." Clara suddenly paused. Her pencil hovered above the page. She turned toward the window slowly, her breath fogging the glass. "They're following us," she murmured. Hayes and Morgan exchanged a sharp, anxious look. "Who's following?" "Clara," the doctor asked carefully. She pressed her fingertips to the cold pane. "You can't see them, not with eyes. They're in the spaces, between everything." Her voice trembled. "They don't like moving water. But they found a way around it." Morgan whispered, "Good God!" The train shrieked around a curve, and for a flicker of a second, just long enough to doubt your own senses, Morgan thought he saw something ripple across the snow outside. Not a shadow, not light. Something like a distortion, a pressure in the air, something watching. When they reached the hospital in Farmington, a tall brick institution surrounded by bare trees and iron fences, Clara stood silently between them, small and pale against the vast structure. Missouri State Hospital No. 4 was considered progressive for its time, but its long corridors and clinical atmosphere still carried the unmistakable echo of suffering, whispering patients, distant footsteps, doors closing on secrets. They were greeted by Dr. Eleanor Reed, one of the few female psychiatrists practicing in Missouri. Sharp-eyed, composed, and fiercely intelligent, she approached Clara with a softness that eased Judith's fears. "Hello, Clara," Dr. Reed said, kneeling to meet her gaze. "You're safe here. We're going to help you." Clara studied her for a moment, then whispered, "You can't stop it." Dr. Reed blinked. "Stop what, dear?" The knowing. Clara's hands trembled at her sides. It doesn't care about safety. Morgan opened his mouth to speak, but Reed gently raised a hand. "It's all right," she said. "We'll learn together." Over the next 48 hours, Dr. Reed conducted exam after exam. Her notes would later become some of the most chilling documents in Missouri's medical archives. Patient is oriented to person and place, but not to time. She describes sensations of information pressing into her mind, accompanied by headaches and tremors. Exhibits extraordinary cognitive abilities in mathematics and physics with no prior training. Neurological examinations reveal no abnormalities. Behavior suggests neither hallucination nor delusion in the classical sense. During one session, Reed asked carefully, "Clara, where did the knowledge come from?" Clara hesitated, then answered in a whisper that made Reed's blood go cold. The sky opened. Reed leaned forward. "Win the cold night. The night Mama cried." "What happened then?" Clara shut her eyes tightly. "They poured in like water, but sharp. Papa tried to stop it. They both tried." Reed asked softly, "Where are your parents now, Clara?" Clara opened her eyes. There was no emotion in them, just a vast, exhausted emptiness. "They made room," she said, "and then they weren't there anymore." Dr. Reed wrote in her private notes later that night, "There is something profoundly unnatural about the timing of Clara's symptoms. The sudden onset of impossible knowledge, the disappearance of her parents, the deterioration of her physical condition, the relentless drive to complete the calculations. I fear something has entered this child's mind, something neither she nor we can contain." Meanwhile, Morgan and Dr. Hayes stayed nearby, reviewing Clara's pages in a small borrowed office. "These calculations," Morgan whispered, "they're evolving, growing, as if building toward something." Hayes looked up sharply. "Building toward what?" Morgan shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said, "but whatever it is, it's not meant for us." Late that night, just after midnight, Clara awoke in her hospital bed with a scream so piercing that nurses rushed from every direction. When they reached her, she was curled into a tight ball, hands pressed against her skull, sobbing as though something inside her was tearing her apart. "They're here!" she cried. "They found me again, Doctor." Reed held her tightly, whispering comfort, but Clara struggled, pointing toward the ceiling. "They're getting closer!" "They're almost inside. It hurts. It hurts so much." And then, in a voice barely human in its desperation, "Please make them stop. Please. I can't hold it anymore." The lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and in that sterile hospital room everyone present felt it, a presence. Not seen, not heard, but cold, vast, watching. Something had followed Clara, something that wanted the pattern finished, something that would not let her go. The days following Clara's admission to Missouri State Hospital brought no relief, only escalation. Dr. Eleanor Reed, methodical and compassionate, spent hours interviewing the girl, charting her symptoms, and recording every detail with scientific precision. But the deeper she delved into Clara's case, the more she felt she was drifting away from medicine and into something far older and far darker. By early February 1916, Clara's condition had become the center of whispered conversations among staff. Nurses avoided walking past her room alone. Orderlies refused to enter after sunset. Even seasoned doctors spoke of a pressure in the air around her bed, an unexplainable heaviness that raised the hairs on their arms. She was unraveling, not rapidly, not violently, but in a slow, terrible surrender, piece by piece. Every morning when Dr. Reed arrived, she found Clara already awake, already writing, already trembling. Her once steady hands now shook with every stroke of the pencil. Her ink-stained fingers bore small cuts where she had gripped the metal edges of her writing tools too tightly. "Clara," Reed whispered gently one morning, "you have to rest. Your body can't endure this much strain." "I know," Clara said without looking up, "but they won't let me." "Who won't let you?" "The ones in the knowing." Reed sat beside her. "Tell me what you mean." Clara finally raised her head, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. "If I stop, the pressure hurts more. Writing makes it quieter. Reed wrote in her journal that night, "Patient displays voluntary surrender to external cognitive influence. She believes writing is a relief mechanism, not an assignment." This suggests she is not hallucinating an entity, but responding to an intrusive internal force she cannot escape. By mid-February, the physical toll was undeniable. Clara grew thinner by the day. Her appetite vanished entirely. Nurse's spoon fed her broth, but it brought no color back to her cheeks. Her skin became almost translucent in the winter light, veins showing faintly beneath the surface. Worse were the episodes. The first episode struck during a supervised writing period. Clara suddenly gasped, dropping her pencil. Blood trickled from her nose. She swayed forward, trembling violently. Dr. Reed rushed to catch her as she collapsed. "Clara, Clara, can you hear me?" The girl's eyes fluttered. Then she whispered, "It's too much. Too much. They're pushing more in. They said I'm too slow." Reed felt ice settle in her stomach. This wasn't a child suffering from delusion. This was a child being crushed by something she couldn't contain. The second episode came a week later and left the entire ward shaken. A night nurse heard whispering coming from Clara's room, two overlapping voices. One was Clara's, soft and strained. The other was not a child's voice. It was deeper, slower, heavy like a sound vibrating through stone. When the nurse opened the door, Clara sat upright in her bed, staring into an empty chair as though someone sat there. She spoke in a strange rhythm, a numbered cadence, a language the nurse did not recognize. When the nurse called her name, Clara turned, startled. Not angry, not violent, but terrified. "They're measuring," she whispered. "They're measuring how much room is left." "Room for what?" The nurse stammered. Clara pointed at her own head. "The knowing. It's filling up everything." The nurse left trembling. She refused to return to Clara's room alone. Dr. Reed, though shaken, did not waver. She began journaling her concerns more candidly in her private notebook. "I am increasingly convinced that Clara's intellect is being used, not enhanced. Her mind is not generating these calculations. It is being forced to host them. Every attempt to restrict her writing results in physical distress. This suggests a direct correlation: the less she writes, the more harm she suffers. Is it possible that her brain is acting as a conduit? And if so, for what?" To test her theory, Dr. Reed made a risky decision. For 1 week, Clara was prevented, gently but firmly, from writing. Her pencils were taken, her papers removed. She was engaged in normal activities for a girl her age: drawing, walking, reading, playing simple games. The results were immediate. Her headaches decreased. Her appetite improved. Her hands stopped trembling. The circles under her eyes faded slightly. On the third day, she even laughed softly at a small bird perched on her windowsill. Judith Hayes, who visited to check on her, cried with relief. But Dr. Reed was watching closely. Clara wasn't healed. She was empty. Her eyes seemed strangely unfocused, as if waiting for something to resume. Finally, on the 7th night, the breakthrough came. Clara woke screaming. She clawed at the sheets. She pounded her fists against her temples. She sobbed violently, gasping for breath. Reed rushed in, holding her, trying to calm her. "What's happening? Clara, tell me!" Clara cried harder. "They're angry," she wailed. "I stopped making room. They can't fit." "They're pushing all at once." Reed froze. Then slowly, painfully, Clara whispered, "They said if I don't start again, they'll find someone else." Reed restored Clara's writing privileges the next morning. Not because it was helping her, but because stopping her might kill her, or worse, shift the attention of whatever was inside her mind to another host. By March, Clara's work had changed. The equations grew more abstract, more intricate, moving beyond Euclidean geometry, beyond classical physics, into something no scientist in 1916 could have imagined. Professor Morgan visited again. When he saw the new pages, he turned pale. "This isn't just math," he whispered. "It's a language, a complete system. Something is communicating through her." Reed swallowed. "Communicating what?" Morgan shook his head slowly. "I think Clara is building toward an answer, but I fear the question wasn't hers." Clara's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Her weight plummeted. Her sleep became erratic. Her temperature sometimes dropped dangerously low. She frequently went into trances, eyes open, handwriting mechanically. Yet she pressed on. "It has to be finished," she told Reed one day, barely conscious. "They're waiting." "Who is waiting, Clara?" Reed asked. Clara lifted a shaking hand and pointed to the ceiling. "Not above," she whispered. Between what? Reed wanted to ask, but the child had already slipped back into her calculations. By late April, Reed wrote one final chilling entry in her journal. "Whatever has entered Clara's mind is consuming her. The more she writes, the weaker she becomes. The less she writes, the more violently it presses against her. Her mind is a battlefield, and her body is the casualty." Something had claimed Clara Caldwell, and it was not letting go. Not until the pattern was complete, not until the answer was finished, not until Clara's mind had given all it could offer. By the summer of 1916, Missouri State Hospital No. 4 had become a silent battleground. Nurses whispered about Clara in the hallways. Patients avoided her room. The doctors, those who had once scoffed at rumors, now walked past her door with averted eyes, as if afraid the strange knowledge filling her mind might spill into theirs. Dr. Eleanor Reed and Professor James Morgan were the only two who remained steadfast. They documented everything, cross-referenced her equations, tracked every change in her behavior, and argued daily about how to save her, or at least slow the damage. But it was already too late. Clara was fading. The child who had entered the hospital months earlier, frightened and trembling, was now a thin, fragile shadow, her skin nearly translucent, her hair dull and tangled, her hands permanently stained with ink. And yet she still wrote. Even when her fingers shook so violently, she could barely hold the pencil. Even when her breath came in short gasps from exhaustion. Even when her nosebleeds left brown-red stains across the pages, she wrote. Driven not by curiosity, not by talent, but by something vast and incomprehensible that demanded completion. On September 7, 1916, a woman arrived at the hospital. She signed the visitor's log as Elizabeth Caldwell, claiming to be Robert Caldwell's sister from Illinois. She presented letters, family photographs, a birth certificate, documents that seemed in perfect order. She had the calm, confident manner of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. But Dr. Reed felt something was wrong the moment she shook her hand. Elizabeth's grip was too firm. Her eyes lingered too long. Her expressions shifted like someone performing emotion rather than feeling it. There was a coldness beneath her polite smiles, a precision to her movements that unsettled Reed deeply. Still, hospital protocol required Reed to comply. "You've come to take your niece home, Doctor?" Reed asked cautiously. Elizabeth folded her gloved hands. "I've come to correct a mistake. Clara should never have been brought here. Your brother and his wife have been missing for months." Reed pressed. "Do you have any information about their whereabouts?" Elizabeth smiled politely. It did not reach her eyes. "Children don't need every answer, only stability." Reed's uneasiness grew. "She is deeply ill," she emphasized. "She needs medical supervision." Elizabeth tilted her head with a strange, mechanical grace. "No, she needs privacy." That afternoon, when Elizabeth and Dr. Reed met privately in Reed's office, the conversation took a chilling turn. Elizabeth sat perfectly still, legs crossed, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her voice was calm, controlled. But what she said left Reed shaken. "There is a history in the Caldwell family," Elizabeth began. Episodes, Reed repeated. "What kind?" "Sudden intellectual awakenings, bursts of knowledge, behaviors common among certain members of my lineage." Elizabeth paused. "Robert experienced one as a child. Far weaker than Clara's?" "Of course." Reed stiffened. "Weaker." Elizabeth nodded. "Clara's manifestation is more potent than any we've seen in generations. But the strain is the same. It always takes a toll." Reed felt cold creep up her arms. "You're suggesting this is hereditary? That her condition is normal for your family?" "Not normal," Elizabeth said softly. "Expected." "What happened to the others?" Reed asked. The woman smiled faintly. "They didn't survive." Silence filled the room. Reed gripped her pen tightly. You're telling me that 3 other Caldwell children died from similar symptoms? Yes, Elizabeth said simply. Clara's parents moved her to the Ozarks to isolate her, to delay the inevitable attention. When the sky opened, they knew there wasn't time. Reed's heart pounded. What do you mean, when the sky opened? Elizabeth's eyes flickered with something Reed could not name. They hoped to help her contain it, Elizabeth said quietly. But she was too strong, and they were too small. Reed's throat tightened. Small, in what way? Elizabeth leaned forward. Not enough room. Those were Clara's words. Almost exactly. Reed's chest tightened with dread. What happened to Robert and Mary? She whispered. Elizabeth's expression didn't change. They made room. 2 days later, with paperwork approved, Clara was released into her aunt's custody. Professor Morgan protested violently.
She's not stable. She's still deteriorating.
She needs monitoring. Elizabeth touched his shoulder gently, a gesture uncomfortably intimate. Thank you for your concern, Professor, she said. We'll take excellent care of her. Morgan recoiled at the word we. There was only one woman in the room, but her tone suggested otherwise. Clara, frail and resigned, did not resist. She glanced once at Dr. Reed, eyes empty of hope. They're calling again, she whispered. It's louder with her here. Reed clenched her fists. Clara, are you afraid? No, Clara said softly. And then, I'm tired. Elizabeth placed a firm hand on the girl's shoulder. Come, child. We have much to finish. Finish. A word that rang like a death sentence. On September 12, 1916, Clara Caldwell was escorted out of Missouri State Hospital No. 4. She never returned, and the woman who called herself her aunt was never seen again. When Clara left Missouri State Hospital No. 4, with the woman calling herself Elizabeth Caldwell, a terrible silence settled over the institution. Dr. Reed and Professor Morgan stood at the tall front windows watching the automobile disappear down the long dirt road, the dust rising behind it like a curtain closing on a tragedy neither of them could stop. Reed felt a physical ache in her chest. Morgan whispered, "We will never see her again." Reed didn't answer, because she knew, deep in her bones, that whatever had taken hold of Clara wasn't finished. Not even close. For months after Clara's disappearance, Dr. Reed wrote letters. First to the Springfield address Elizabeth had provided, then to several Illinois physicians who might have known Dr. Thomas Blackwood, the alleged specialist treating Clara. No reply. No confirmation. No record of the man. No trace of the address. Every thread Reed followed dissolved into nothing. Morgan conducted his own investigation in 1920, traveling to Springfield himself, visiting libraries, churches, public records offices. He found no Caldwell relatives, no medical specialist named Blackwood, no property records matching the location Elizabeth had claimed. The woman had been a ghost. The documents she carried, expertly forged. The photographs, staged. And Clara vanished in plain sight. But further answers, dark, fragile, incomplete, did emerge years later from scattered fragments that historians would eventually connect like pieces of a cursed mosaic. In 1924, a sanitarium in northern Wisconsin admitted a woman registered only as Jane Doe. A middle-aged woman brought her in, paid 10 years of care in advance, and vanished without leaving her name. That woman matched Elizabeth's description perfectly. Jane Doe never spoke, never recognized anyone, never sought to escape, but she wrote. God, she wrote. Nurses found notebooks under her bed, beneath her mattress, hidden in drawers, tucked behind radiators. Hundreds of pages, filled to the edges with symbols, Clara's symbols. Equations that spiraled, twisted, pulsed with the same terrible intelligence that had consumed the child in Missouri. The staff eventually stopped trying to understand the writings, but one visiting researcher did understand. Dr. Harold Bennett, a psychologist from the University of Chicago, arrived in 1938 while studying cases of extreme mathematical savantism. When he saw Jane Doe's notebooks, he froze. He had seen these equations before, in old academic journals referencing the Caldwell girl. He visited Jane Doe repeatedly, trying to speak to her, hoping to confirm the impossible. She sat expressionless during every visit, until his fourth. That day she looked up, directly into his eyes. Her lips trembled. Her first words in nearly 15 years. "It's almost complete now. They're coming back for it soon." 3 days later, she was found dead at her desk, pencil still in hand, body slumped over a final, finished page of calculations. Her expression, according to the doctor's report, was relieved. All of her notebooks, 16 years' worth, were taken by Bennett for study. Within months, government officials seized the documents. Bennett himself accepted a classified research position. He never spoke publicly about the case again. In 1962, nearly half a century after Clara vanished, construction workers near the old Caldwell property unearthed 2 skeletons. A man and a woman, arranged deliberately in a geometric pattern. The positioning, a mirrored spiral, matched the earliest diagrams in Clara's childhood notebooks. Though no formal identification was possible with the forensic limitations of the time, everyone knew. They had found Robert and Mary Caldwell. What they had not found was how they died. There were no signs of animal attack, no blunt force trauma, no bullet wounds. Just bodies positioned like pieces of an equation offering, a sacrifice, a rearrangement. No one could say. The case was officially closed in 1963, but not because answers were found. It was closed because the truth was too large, too strange, too threatening for the world to confront. Official records read, Robert and Mary Caldwell deceased, means unknown, Clara Caldwell, presumed deceased. Unofficially, Clara had become something else entirely, a vessel, a conduit, a mind open too wide. The final page preserved in the Shannon County Historical Society, the last original remnant of Clara's work, carries symbols modern mathematicians still cannot decode. But in the margin, written in a trembling child's script, the knowing wants out. It wasn't meant to be kept inside a person. Locals say the forest near the old Caldwell site still feels wrong. Compasses misbehave. Birds refuse to nest. Hunters get headaches the moment they step near the clearing. Some swear that on cold winter nights, you can hear a faint scratching sound, like pencil on paper, coming from somewhere deep in the pines, calculating, repeating, waiting. Because whatever entered Clara Caldwell in 1915 never truly left this world. It simply began looking for more room. T80 end.